Okay, now this is getting the World Watchers. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 612, August 29th, 1983. Side one of this broadcast, if you tape record it, and we tuck this month away again. They roll around, it seems a month goes like a week. Very quickly, just to review what happened this time last year that I usually do. That was in August the 30th, 1982, broadcast number 560. I was talking about the still missing money from the Nugan Bank. It's a year later, and they haven't found it. They're $500 million to $1 billion. Updating the Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger investigation. I just sent letters off this week to Washington, to the German offices. I got some new addresses that were in the back of several books to inquire where Hitler's Fritz Kramer was. If I can't find the American, I want to go for the German. Where did he go? We were talking about the debt crisis after the Banco Ambrosiano scandals, and they're still continuing. And to update that, inside the Vatican, Paul Marcinkus today was officially charged, along with two men outside the Vatican, but involved with Vatican money, and Banco Ambrosiano. It took a year, but Marcinkus officially now, if he walks out the door of the Vatican, can be arrested. He was the treasurer for the Pope. He still is. He was his bodyguard. A great golfer, sportsman from Chicago, part of the old Al Capone gang, linked to the mafia and organized crime, and caught with forging documents and corporate papers 10 years ago, never prosecuted, was getting away with that out of Liechtenstein, and a good book, The Vatican Connection, on the crimes of Paul Marcinkus. Well, they're closing on him a little bit more. Very quickly, I want to run down about 5 or 10 different stories for you in the news and get back to them later, hopefully, and go on to Klaus Barbie tonight, because Barbie is the #1 story and will be for a long time. As the London Observer had on their front page story last Sunday, there were 70,000 war criminals and 50,000 left. The Americans alone had listed 70,000 war criminals and 50,000 left Europe. So there's 49,000 plus Klaus Barbie. Just a funny commentary about KFJC. That's a sister station that plays World Watchers, and they play Hard Rain. David Emory has a talk show up there with Nip Tuck, and so Ted Rubenstein calls in, and a lot of informed people. It probably has a continuous series of the best news stories on the criminal investigations that are going, the people in the news that are involved in assassinations and swindling money and interconnecting spy stories. They're on every week and have been doing this continuously for a few years at a tremendous pace. Last week, KFJC made news because they played Louie Louie over again for 63 hours. There's 800 versions of a song written by Richard Berry in 1955, and the Wall Street Journal on the front page has a story August 25th. No, Louie Louie is too lousy for this FM station. Now, the Wall Street Journal even ignores wars and coups and all kinds of things. And I don't even remember a front-page story about anything like this. It's about KFJC in Los Altos, California, that had a non-stop program for 3 consecutive days where they played Louie Louie for 3 days. And they printed the verse. It's actually the front-page story, a whole column, and then it concludes inside, and it tells how the FBI at one time was interested in it, because if they played at different speeds, they thought there was something dirty in it. There's nothing dirty, and it's the most simple kind of song written in 1955, but KFJC, instead of making the headlines for the stories we're breaking week after week, the news stories, every single one of them, or one from what we're saying, should be making the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So somebody's listening to the station, but they preferred to write Louie Louie. That's fine. I think it's great. Western Goals, the great organization set up by Larry McDonald of Murder Incorporated, with branches of Mr. George Habash in Beirut, Lebanon, and his brother in Chile. Western Goals, the organization whose computers pipe into the Los Angeles Police Department, and Jay Paul, part of Western Goals, taking them to his garage in Long Beach. They're going to have a television program next week. On the board is the Honorable Roy Cohn of also the syndicate and the mob in the Los Angeles Police Department. Admiral Thomas H. Moore, involved with stealing from President Nixon for Henry Kissinger. Oh, it's a great crowd. And I'll give you Dr. Edward Teller. I've told you who's on Western Goals. I'll give you the address if you have a pencil. If you don't have a pencil, you should have one ready when you listen to this broadcast. If not, write to me with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll give you the information. My box is 22511, Carmel 93922. The 111 South Columbus Street, Alexandria, Virginia, 22314 is the zip code. Area code 703-549-6688. Now, are you ready? They're going to have a television show on terrorism, the KGB. Here these people are involved with international funding of Carlos, the Baader-Meinhof, the Japanese Red Army, the Italian Red Brigade, the SLA, the Manson family. These are the networks of terrorism like the Reichstag in this country. The authorities, it's called No Place to Hide, international terrorism. You notice how the Pope story faded out, and Ajah really is from the Grey Wolves and the Nazis, so when they went to investigate and the judge went to Bulgaria, had it shut up. Have you noticed not a word about it? Well, this program will be on September the 11th. That's a Sunday night, 8:05 Eastern Time, 5:05 Pacific, and 7:05 Central. And all of you who take these broadcasts should be able to get the announcement before next Sunday night. Western Goals is going to have terrorism, and you can hear it. This was sent to a subscriber in Texas asking for money for advertising. There's a book, No Place to Hide, The Strategy and Tactics of Terrorism, and then more on subversion. There's a picture of Larry McDonald, chairman and president of this wonderful Western Goals. And on there, of course, is John Reese, the editor, who's part of the House Un-American Activities. His wife worked for Senator Joe McCarthy. And John Reese was put into this job by J. Peter Grace. We were talking about him on the talk show before this program began. He was put on, J. Peter Grace started funding John Reese, Grace, the partner of Otto Ambrose of I.G. Farben and Auschwitz Gas. Okay, Sunday at 11 o'clock, that's Turner, Ted Turner Broadcasting. Cable television, that's Channel 3. Here, I don't know where it is in your hometown, but if you don't have a cable TV, go find somebody so that you'll know what terrorism is or where it comes. I want to mention a few judges that are courageous. We always talk about the bad people. Just quickly, there's Judge Leonard Sand in New York. He's the one who's talking about the gold nuggets that belong to Mark Rich, who's pursuing the suit, who wants the papers turned over that lead to oil profits and tax money flown out of this country to Swiss banks that could link to the raising of oil prices when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State in the early 70s. Judge Oscar Salvi, S-A-L-V-I. I read that he was risking his life in Argentina. He's gotten death threats. He has ordered the Argentine government to tie up the money in two places of Licio Gelli, who fled the Swiss prisons. He wants to break the story of the Masonic Lodge, the P2, the fascism, the holdover from fascist Europe. He's pursuing the tying up the money and risking his life. Another person who risked his life was Mr. Benigno Aquina of the Philippines. I'll do more on that story later and not much tonight. I'm going to have an Aquino contest if you want to join the contest. And the person who sends me the most comparisons between the Aquino assassination in the Philippines and the cover-up, including the cover-up of the assassination, to the John Kennedy assassination and the cover-up. Whoever can find the most comparisons, I'll give a prize to, probably a book or some kind of a prize. Two other judges of courage, and the reason I take their names down, and you should take note, is that any day they could be gunned down, and instead of waiting till they're dead to know their contributions, I think we should take time out to say there are people in the world doing something for us, because this is a worldwide fascism they're fighting, and I think we owe it to them. One is Giuliano Turone, Giuliano Turone, and the other is Gerardo Colombo, Gerardacolombo, Colombo. And they are in Italy, and those are the two judges that decided in May of 1981 to go into the home of Licio Gelli, break into the home, and take from him documents which included the names of almost 1,000 people that belong to the Masonic Lodge that wants international fascism all over the world, Mr. Licio Gelli's goal. Now, just a quick comment about three events that took place this week. One was Benigno Aquino, of course. He lived in the Philippines. He was in jail 7 years. He had the love of the people. I wonder why he never investigated the Phalange, or he fought in the war, or Mr. Willoughby, Charles Willoughby of American intelligence and his link with the Nazis, and go into the roots of the fascism of President Marcos. You cannot not fight fascism by just walking off a plane and having people wave to you. The best way, I think, to meet these people is to dig them out by the roots with their links to the Klaus Barbies and Martin Bormann and Joseph Mengele and the Vatican, Pope Pius XII and Pope Montini, or the current John Paul II with their Nazi IG Farben connections. At least meet them eyeball to eyeball and say, this is what you are, is this what we want? The next point is the anniversary of Martin Luther King, the 20th anniversary of I Have a Dream. The racism is the same in the United States. The leadership is gone. Jesse Jackson and Andrew Young were on the balcony when Martin Luther King was murdered. The FBI wanted to select the next black leader. They have never said anything or spoken up. The House Select Committee on Assassination said there was a conspiracy, and I mentioned that, I believe, last week when I was talking about Raoul and these conspiracies, and I say it over and over again. When are they or anybody else going to speak up and name the people who killed their predecessors and then get on with the show? There was a broadcast, Charles Carroll, Sunday morning, good program he always has, and he was talking about the Weavers. His last interview with Lee Hayes just before he died, and he talked about the members of the Weavers and what they're doing now. Bonnie Gilbert just made a new record. Pete Seeger, of course, you know. They were blacklisted during the Senator Joe McCarthy days. They were kicked out of television, radio, thrown off the map of entertainment in this country. Why not investigate Senator Joe McCarthy? And they would have scratched him 1 minute. They find the Nazis had sent him money when he was in the Marines to run in Wisconsin for the Senate. It's okay to sing about labor unions and social change and civil rights, but you got to meet these people, I think, eyeball to eyeball, or be willing to be gunned down one after the other. And you can write all the songs you want, but until you really lay it on the line who you're meeting, I don't think this is going to end. Now, Mr. Begin resigned. He's going to be through with the government. I think I mentioned last week or the week before what a sad, pathetic dog he is. The newspaper this morning, just Monday morning, said he is resigning and may quit by today. He is definitely on the way out, and some newspapers were caught by surprise. I don't think it's a surprise. I don't see how a human being can take so much. And there's a book that just came out, and a World Watcher sent this to me from New York, Zionism in the Age of Dictators. And it tells about a man, Chaim Ariel Sof, A-R-L-O, Arlo, Soroff, S-O-R-O-F-F, who was murdered 50 years ago, gunned down, while Israel was still Palestine, and he was active with the early movement of Jews out of Nazi Germany. His papers of his murder have been kept in the British archives for 50 years, and they're going to be released within the next week or two. And the man responsible for his murder was Menachem Begin. And it's 50 years later. He's run the country. Weinstein warned us about him, warned them about him, but Begin is out. It doesn't surprise me at all. And the investigation of Aquino will be covered up. Also, our friend John Tower is out. Does that surprise you? Remember the Vicki Morgan tapes and the suggestion that there was a congressman on there? Well, I think Tower would be the #1 candidate. In fact, I had done broadcasts on John Tower and John Layman, Secretary of Navy, and quotations from the book Maxine Cheshire about the Psalms Pantaloon parties they have. There's a story in the Houston Post, Wednesday, August the 24th. Tower draws ire of his former aides. They're furious that he stepped down. They didn't know, and they said the real reason, the Houston Post said, is at his right arm. She's right there at the news conference. That is Mrs. Tower, Leila, L-I-L-L-A. Leila Tower is the reason. It doesn't say why. They said this is distressing, it's disloyal. He didn't even tell us, he just said he's out. Leila is the sister of Samuel Cummings, who arms the people that Western Goals is going to tell you are terrorists. He's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and his brother-in-law arms the terrorists all over the world to give the excuse for Interpol and the police states to crack down on terrorists. Now, there are a lot of articles on why or why not Senator Tower is leaving. I think he's a scandal. His relationship to Henry Kissinger and John Aleman has been questionable. And the way he resigned, I would wonder if there's a relationship to the tapes that Alfred Bloomingdale had, because this is one of the men that was closest to Ronald Reagan. And if there were one congressman on those videotapes, I would think that it would be John Tower. And so he is out. The Congress will be better for it. And I'm not at all surprised, but I just have to question, was he on? They're going to say they're non-existent tapes, but that's not true. Now, the John DeLorean story I'll update for a few seconds. There's a massive lawsuit, $400 million suit in Miami. 132 investors, Sammy Davis Jr., Roy Clark, invested $18.7 million to fund research of the DeLorean motor. This is a gigantic lawsuit. Sidney Rudolph filed it, chairman of the board of Wendy Corp. That's Wendy Hamburger. And the Wall Street Journal had a story on this. The Los Angeles Herald has one, too. And the attorney representing them is Murray Sams Jr. He's representing 131 people who contributed $75,000 to $425,000 each to DeLorean Research Limited, and they want to know where the $18.7 million went. Well, I called Miami and talked to Mr. Sams, and I have to say, in all the years I've done research, he seemed to be the most interested. And when I mentioned Robert Durand or Jack Catane and the Carson connections, and DeLorean possibly being with Klaus Barbie down in Bolivia and giving him just a resume of Christian Von Damme and Elaine Von Damme and the cocaine down in the Bank of America transactions, he really seemed anxious. So today I got off a package of material to him, and we'll see what happens when he gets that. It's a complicated story if you don't think of it in those terms, but we'll see what follows with that. There's a new book out on John DeLorean, The Rise and Fall of John DeLorean, and I'll discuss that more with you later. Ivan Fallon, Fallon, and James Srodes, Srodes. The first chapter was reprinted in the paper today, and it was very interesting. They also mentioned that Catherine DeLorean, his mother, was a refugee from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, that sounds pretty watsy, you know. And then it says his mother worked as a tool assembler for General Electric. She was probably working for General Electric when Ronald Reagan was. We'd have to check the time problem, but I think it's pretty interesting. And she's a refugee from this empire. First they tell you how poor he is, and then all of a sudden he's at these special schools and he's got upward mobility. Johnny Carson has been dropped from his share of that banking scandal, and he wants to countersue. He says that they're trying to smear him, but his partner, Henry Bushkin, is still named by people in the lawsuit to open up the Carson links, that bank, to organized crime and offshore banking. And Carson was complaining because the various people on the board of the bank, a Mr. Copelson and Mr. Miller, attorneys in the same law firm with Henry Bushkin, went to Johnny Carson's wife without Johnny's permission and got information or substance from her. And Mrs. Carson was had them drop in at the Hotel Pierre, and she was talking about Johnny's investments, and she was on her way to Rome, Italy, which I thought was rather interesting. And they're complaining that these people have snooped around with Johnny Carson's wife, and I'm sure she would know plenty. But because John DeLorean is so much part of the Johnny Carson Bank and the people involved, I mentioned that Carson's name has been dropped, but Henry Bushkin is still on that lawsuit. And also the judge said this week that we will take maybe 2 years with the John DeLorean case, that we have to get the documents from the Central Intelligence Agency and from the National Security Council that I mentioned last week because of the possible link of the British government with John DeLorean. We know they gave him money. They want to unravel this case, but now the latest is it will take 2 years possibly. And Cardinal Cooke, the fellow who I mentioned to Mr. Sams on the telephone, the fellow that DeLorean was allegedly seeing in New York every day when he was in New York, is now dying of cancer. That happened very quickly. It's sort of a Jack Ruby cancer. The paper said this week he's severely ill. He's also head of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta and knighted Johnny Carson's friend, Mr. McMahon, this summer. His life will be over. It's a shorter period of time than we imagine. He's the Archbishop of New York that took over after Cardinal Francis Spellman. And he also has the title of military vicar, overseeing the religious church. See, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta is the military branch of the Vatican that keeps the wars going to keep the Roman Church in power. And just an article in the San Francisco Chronicle said that he is the military vicar. That's the first time I've seen it printed that way. And they're urging stiff penalties for DeLorean's aide, who is refusing to testify against him. Stephen Lee Arrington says that he will not testify against him. He knows what he's doing. He's playing it cautious. And the government is asking, the federal judge is asking for papers because, according to the Los Angeles Times, August 26th, it may be an international plot. So that story gets thicker. Another interesting item about a fellow who was gunned down in Miami, Jose Braulio Aleman, Braulio Aleman. The Miami Herald had the story, August 1983. He was a multimillionaire who had holdings in Cuba, anywhere from $20 to $40 million, his family. They lived there when Batista was there. At first he helped Fidel Castro and he left. He joined the anti-Castro Cubans, and in 1978, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was investigating John Kennedy's murder, he was the witness that told the House Select Committee that Santo Trafficante, the mafia chief, told him, Aleman, that Kennedy would be killed soon. This was in the spring that he told him, and this was the testimony in the summer of 1963, that soon Kennedy would be hit. He was the son of a Cuban senator, a minister of education, an educated person himself, part of a cattle magnate and family of prominence in Cuba, worth, as I say, between $29 and $200 million. So this isn't a kook who owned property in Miami, large holdings also, who died by the bullet just a few weeks ago, another witness to the Kennedy assassination. Now, one more article before we get into the Klaus Barbie story. Italy seizes the assets of 2 Vatican bank officers. 2 bankers for the Vatican have now been held down. That's Luigi Manini. I've mentioned him on other broadcasts. Luigi, Luigi Manini, Mennini, and Pellegrino Destrobel, Pellegrino, small Destrobel. They were part of the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano last year. That's Italy's largest bank, but they are also part of the Vatican Bank, and the arrest took place just today. The Vatican Bank, known as the Institute for Religious Work, has as its head the United States Archbishop Paul C. Marcinkus. Now, Marcinkus is an American citizen, so right now he is not picked up on the charges of transferring money and missing money out of the Vatican or out of Italy. Marcinkus, Manini, and Destrobel were sent legal notices 1 year ago, telling them they were under investigation by the Milan public officials. At that time, the Vatican refused to accept the documents on the ground that it was a sovereign state, so the court couldn't act against these assets until recently, and now they've been able to send a letter and say that the Vatican bankers, with their links to the Banco Ambrosiano, would be and can be arrested, and the papers have been officially served. Now, there were some very important articles on Klaus Barbie that affect all of us, and because they were so large, each one of these was approximately an entire page of a newspaper. I don't mean a little column. I'm going to share them with you for the remaining time, and there's some very important information in them. The first was the London Observer. This was on the 21st of August, the Sunday London Observer. Barbie, the Vatican Connections. Klaus Barbie, the Nazi war criminal who personally tortured, who personally sent people to concentration camps and physically stomped on them and so forth. And this is about his links to the Vatican, and it begins, as I said before, of the 70,000 Nazi war criminals who came on the Allied books in 1945. 50,000 escaped retribution. There were 21 different rat lines, and there were 21 service organizations that the Vatican set out. I told you last week that Mr. Ryan's report was a total lie and fraud. And the time that he was issuing this report, Andrew Wilson from the London Observer had a much bigger story. He said there's a disturbing link between the Vatican and the United States intelligence. that the United States Justice Department report by Mr. Ryan only lifts a corner of a gigantic tale. That's what I was saying last week when I was outraged. They said the tale involves the United States intelligence, which would be the Office of Strategic Service that became the CIA, and Army intelligence and Navy intelligence and so forth, and the Freemasonry of the SS, that's Himmler's Gestapo, and the Gestapo officers of Hitler, and to the chagrin of the Catholics, the Vatican Church. It's the three, the United States intelligence, the Nazis, and the Vatican, and the secret governments go hand in hand. That's why I say we had a coup in 1963 that involved all these elements. When John Kennedy was murdered, they all had a piece of that action. The article says there was a scramble after the war to get these people. It didn't matter how evil they were recruited. Barbie, with a German from the Abwehr, that's Hitler's intelligence, A-B-W-E-H-R, by the name of Mr. Merck. Many of you know his name. You've seen it in the paper or on television. Barbie had 50 paid informants under the Barbie Merck network, all the same kind of high-level Nazi criminals. And France wanted them, and the Vatican was busy evacuating these people. Not only did the American Army have a unit, but they set one up in Austria. And Austria worked with the Americans. If the people that Austria wanted that were in the American compound or prison, they'd ask for them, and if Americans wanted some that they had gathered from France and Europe to be sent out of the country, they used what they called the rat lines that were involved through the Vatican and through the Red Cross with Red Cross passports, and we gave them each $1,400, and they were on their way, and they went through the Vatican, and the American government worked with that. I call him Dragonovich, D-R-A-G-O-N-O-V-I-C. It's actually Dracula, I think, but his father, Dragonovic, from a Croatian, took the Croatian war criminals in the Iron Guard, and the Vatican was pouring them out of 21 exits, 21 charity organizations. When Mr. Ryan went to do some more reports on Klaus Barbie, the missing papers were gone, and the London Observer talks about that. But then it gets into something more complicated, and this article says that what is important is an insight into the methods after the war that these people were moved out, and he cites an organization that the Vatican set up called Pro Deo. That means with God, Pro Deo. And the head of the organization was Father Felix Morlion, M-O-R-L-I-O-N, Father Felix Morlion of Pro Deo. That was the Vatican spy system, and William Donovan was the American OSS along with Allen Dulles. Now, Morlion was a papal functionary who became a close friend of Mr. Donovan, who set up the OSS, and Allen Dulles. And he went to the United States in 1940 when Hitler invaded Poland. He moved to New York, where William Donovan and the American government and State Department paid and funded him through the war. The Vatican intelligence was paid by American intelligence while the war went on. In 1944, he was sent back to Rome. Rome fell, but the Nazis were still in Italy, and he was back with the Vatican. So the head of Pro Deo was back in Rome when Rome itself was liberated, and Licio Gelli was still fighting with the Nazis in the north. As soon as the war was over, a year later, William Donovan went on to Rome, and the London Observer describes how he was knighted with the highest papal honor, the Grand Cross of the Order of Sylvester. And it has a picture of Reinhard Gehlen on the front page of the Sunday London Observer for all the world to see, finally, of Pope Pius XII and Klaus Barbie and Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence. And the article tells how William Donovan and Reinhard Gehlen and James Angleton were knighted by the Pope, and has their pictures, as I say. We'll take a 1-minute break and go on to these Klaus Barbie stories because it gets into the Sovereign Military Order Malta, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the melting with the Nazi war criminals. Now we'll go on to side 2. This is Mae Brussell at KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. Broadcast number 612, August 29, 1983. And we're talking about Klaus Barbie and the Vatican, an article in the London Observer And they quoted the magazine in California, Mother Jones, and the research that the author had done for 12 months on the OSS, the CIA, and the Vatican. And it was nice that they mentioned this in the London Observer on the front page story, and tells about, as I say, Reinhard Gehlen being knighted and James Jesus Angleton. Now, Mother Jones accused the Vatican order, the Knights of Malta, of exchanging this knighthood for using agents from each other's agencies and protecting Nazis during the war, suggests that they were protected during the war. And then there's a very interesting sentence, but you have to translate it in terms of what the truth is on the background of this that the writer maybe doesn't know, Andrew Wilson. This is the way they tell the story of Klaus Barbie and the Vatican. They say, prompted by what they see as the present Pope's abandonment of liberation theology and the reversal of the policies of Pope John the 23rd, American critics are now investigating the United States-Vatican relations during and after the war for the evidence of U.S. intelligence penetration of the Vatican hierarchy. Now, it is the other way around. I seriously believe that the United States intelligence, which was the OSS, became invaded by and penetrated by the Vatican network, and the article goes on to say the use of various missions and stations that were convenient that America used. The Jesuit priests and the churches all over the world had a sanctuary, a safe house, tax deductions, and Reinhard Gehlen's brother was a high-up knight in the Vatican, and Gehlen was knighted. Then he came to the United States. The OSS didn't have to work in the Vatican. The Vatican and the Nazis came to the United States and formed the National Security Council and National Security Agency to suit their needs that they had when Adolf Hitler came to power. So that the article in the London Observer is saying that after the war, the U.S. intelligence, which is being investigated by critics like myself, found evidence that we were penetrating the Vatican. When you take a man like John Paul II, who was the protege of Cardinal Montini of Milan, linked to Steve Baum and narcotics traffic and gun running around the world, an actor who worked in the concentration camps during the war at Auschwitz for Solvay Chemical. There's a picture of Solvay Chemical in the new book, The People's Pope, by James Oram. It's not such a new book, and it tells about after the war how Carol Whiteland, who becomes John Paul II, Wagtyla, went to study priesthood, and then in 1946 was ordained. In 1945, summer of 45 to 46, he was in Rome with Montini, and with the Vatican that was writing the passports for the 21 service agencies that were taking 50,000 Nazis out of Europe. He was in Rome with those people because Martin Bormann has been linked to them directly, and Martin Bormann was Klaus Barbie's superior down in South America until the day that Barbie was arrested. Now, getting back to this story in the paper, it mentions Father Morleon in the London Observer as the priest that worked in the United States from 1940 to 44 in charge of Vatican intelligence, who then went back to Rome, and along with William Donovan, they got Donovan knighted. Now, when the London Observer talks about Pro Dio and Mr. Morleon, I want to turn you on to some other information about Morleon that those of you that listen to this program for a long time will really appreciate. After the war, Morleon opened an office in New York City, where he had lived for 4 years, called the American Council for International Promotion of Democracy Under God. Sounds pretty good. The address for the American Council is 118 East 60th Street, New York City, New York, 10022. When I'm in New York, I say on 62nd Street. That's just 2 blocks away. A little coincidence, but I never got the vibes of the place. Mr. Morleon, Felix Morleon, Father Felix Morleon, Vatican, in charge of their intelligence, 118 East 60th Street, New York City, New York, 10022. Now, a researcher went to that address to find out where the office was, to see the American Council for International Promotion of Democracy Under God. There's no office in that building, but the doorman was very friendly and said, oh no, there's no Father Felix Morlean here, but there is a man living here by the name of William Taub, T-A-U-B, the man who wrote the book Forces of Power that I've done broadcasts about. And his book was published by Grosset and Dunlap, published in New York in 1979. And Mr. Taub has the same address in New York City that Morlean has, who worked with the Nazis during and through the war, and with Mr. William Donovan, and was responsible in part for the rat lines to send the 50,000 Nazis out around the world. Now, Mr. William Taub has close connections to the Vatican, and in the book Forces of Power, he talks about his relationship to Richard Nixon and Howard Hughes and the underbelly of U.S. politics, but he talks about a close Vatican associate, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani. In fact, in the back of the book, he credits Ottaviano for part of the work and his close friendship. Page 68, 82, and 83 is indexed, and he tells how he went to Rome to work for a film company for Joseph Kennedy, and how Mr. Ottaviano was the one to Ottaviani, who is the one who gave him a Rubens painting and a Gainsborough painting, oil paintings he had to vouch for. Now, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, in 1929, was the man who initiated the Vatican Bank that's in so much trouble today. For Mussolini, they arranged to give Pope Pius XII $89 million, and I mentioned this on another broadcast in 1978. It's broadcast number 363, if you have the sheets or the tapes, November 17, 1978. And I talked about in 1922, Pope Pius XI was involved with the Spanish Civil War with Hitler. Actually, Pope Pius XII comes in 1939. This is Pope Pius XI at this point, who was the Pope. Pacelli didn't become the Pope until 1939. The one that was funding Adolf Hitler, who's the subject of the book La Popessa, was not in at the time. It was given to Pope Pius XI, and they were involved in coaxing the Vatican not to interfere with what Mussolini or Adolf Hitler would do, and they were going in and take Spain and then turn the world into one big fascist regime for Rome and to get the evil Russians out. Now, the man who gave the Pope the money, Pius I, was Ottaviani, and he was a close friend of William Taub and also the whole network of the Vatican and fascism, and paying off the Vatican and handing them $89 million. Now, that is the money that later got invested by Michael Sindona and Pope Paul VI, the Milan Pope, the Milan Mafia, who, when John the 23rd was dead, took that money and began investing it in crime syndicates and hotel chains and real estate all over the world. So that the William Taub close friend and associate, who works with this man in the Vatican, who works with Morlean, he has the same address in New York City. William Taub and Felix Morlean have the same address in New York City, and the other fellow that works with them, who was instrumental in paying the Vatican that huge hunk of money that really was the source of all their troubles, he was responsible for giving Mussolini this money. He also is a friend of William Taub. So Taub has these close contacts inside the Vatican, but with the very people that were not only silencing future fascism, or the voice of the church against future fascism with this big wad of money, but then used money to get the rat route going to let 50,000 Nazis, Martin Bormann and the whole gang, out of Europe to begin over again. So I think that these connections, I've talked on the broadcast about parts of the book of Forces of Power. William Taub's name first came up with the Vatican. He describes, he went to Rome for a week and it lasted months. While there, I renewed my acquaintance with a friend at the Vatican, Cardinal Ottaviani, who I met 10 years ago through Professor Valletta of Fiat, V-A-L-L-E-T-T-A of Fiat. And he also tells how he had trouble with his Rubens paintings, that he was accused of their being stolen But no, Cardinal Ottaviani vouched for the fact that the Rubens in Gainsborough were given by Cardinal Spellman for Cardinal Ottaviani. And of course, after the war, the oil paintings were taken from all over the world and indeed were stolen. We don't know whether they were confiscated from Jewish homes or where these paintings came from. But the Vatican and Spellman took care of that and gave them, and they ended up with Mr. Tao. Now, another interesting and long story about the Vatican has to do with the Washington Post story. The U.S. Army considered using Barbie as an agent. Maybe many of you read the short version of that. But the essence of this Washington Post story, it came out last week, is that when the Army and the CIA were talking about using him again, the Army still wanted Klaus Barbie in 1968. And the CIA said, you better be careful because the French are asking for him and so forth. But the Army intelligence had him from 1947 to 1951. He was in Bolivia and Argentina from 51 to 65. In 1965, they wanted to rehire him. The Army still wanted him in 1968, and because he had a wonderful South American network with Bolivian generals and colonels. And even though the Ryan report said they turned up no evidence of drug dealing or drug trafficking, that is a total lie. They said there was no evidence of anything in that report of this kind of activity. The U.S. Embassy gave him a A2 visa granted from La Paz when he visited Miami and visited the Bahamas. And goodness knows, with Mr. Albanaf, Robert Albanaf of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, again a knight of the Vatican, and Bieber Rebozo and Richard Nixon, and trips of Klaus Barbie to the Bahamas and to Miami just down the Watergate era, and Michael Sindona heavily funding Richard Nixon's campaign, as listed as jelly was Ronald Reagan. The contacts didn't end when Klaus Barbie went to South America. He just didn't start growing sugar cane or some other thing like that. Another article along the line of Klaus Barbie and the Nazis was the Los Angeles Times story, August 22nd, 1983. A long article, U.S. unit stifled to deport suspected Nazis. And many of you heard some of this. And with the Barbie case coming up and blown up because of the trial, new information comes out. And this article says that 300 cases are still under investigation. These aren't people that were members of the Nazi Party. These were people that killed 20 to 40,000 people or more, or up to 1 million people, in the cruelest way. And it goes on to say that Drew Pearson, in the early 50s, documented reports of former Nazis in the United States. And the article quotes Charles Allen, Jr., who in 1963 said that Nazis were being used by our government, and that was one of the reasons for the presence, and that war criminals were being used by the United States intelligence, and that he identified before Congress in 1978 149 Nazis living in the United States used by our government since World War II, 149. So 50,000 left and scattered around the world, and if you change the names and you have unlimited money, where else are they? The point is that they buy newspapers, the Italian newspapers, the American newspapers, the journalists, the writers. They are doctors on medical staffs. Are they all old? No, they're not old. They've done a lot of damage. Some work with UCLA. They are involved with, for example, Rudolph Winnegar writing the Warren Report. They are our hysterians. They are our physicians. They are the newscasters. They do a lot of things at universities. They're the history professors. They have melded into America and shaped the minds of the American people and the economy and the conditions and the chemicals and the paraquates and the springs and the medical examinations and the mind control. They are working along with those people, and you see their names, and they haven't been ferreted out for the Nazi criminals that they were, and their names, they should print the 139 names, but they're not public right now. Another article about Klaus Barbie, a marvelous article, the San Jose Mercury, by Jonathan Marshall, probably one of the finest I've read, August 21st, 1983, an editorial. Jonathan has a newsletter, Parapolitics. Everyone who is interested in the subject who can afford it should get it. It's $25. You get 4 issues a year. But it's so packed full of information you can just absorb it before the next one comes out. Now, in the San Jose Mercury, he has an editorial, "The United States aid to war criminals didn't stop with Klaus Barbie." And he asked the question that Jewish organizations should be asking, but are not asking: when will justice catch up with the butchers of Warsaw, of Alibuner, Alibuner, of Bucharest, Bucharest, Audrini, Audrina, Borissow, Borisow, and other scenes of Nazi massacres? He said the State Department apology only disguises a deeper and more extensive culpability that accompanying this report is the fact or the truth, that it is incomplete, it is misleading, it is disingenuous. In short, its cover-up continues. And I appreciate a paper like the San Jose Mercury. Here they are right under the wings of the Stanford Institute, Ronald Reagan's hometown and the hotbed of fascism and the various Silicon Valley armament industries. And yet, in this country, there are people that can write an editorial like this. He says that John Loftus, who wrote that book, The Belarus Secret, about the Nazis come to this country, has told about very high war criminals who came to this country, and that John Wilms, the former counterintelligence officer, protected Barbie, knowing that he was accused of torture and murder, going back to 1946. And in 1947, the French, in absentia, said that he was a war criminal. In 1948, a year before the responsibility for the Army officials was covered up, according to the Ryan report, they knew and lied to the French authorities about Barbie, where Barbie was. And the editorial says that this Ryan's report blames a handful of overzealous intelligence officers, and there's righteous indignation in this editorial. How can that happen? That they are invested in minimizing American involvement and reducing it to its most simplistic terms. And the editorial goes on to say that the General Accounting Office knew in 1977 that Nazis were employed by our FBI, by the CIA. They were known to be Nazi war criminals, and that they were working in the United States. And again, he quotes John Loftus and the role he writes in his book, The Belarus Secret. That is a very good book that you should be getting. He cites Project Paperclip, how they were smuggled in this country, 1,500 Austrian and German scientists. And of course, I have said that Galen's Spy of the Century and Project Paperclip are the two most important books to read on what happened to this country, to understand the Kennedy assassination, what happened to this country from the day that Hitler lost the war against the Soviet Union in Leningrad. Those books tell you how the Nazis were used in every area of our government and are used there today. And until people like those marching with the Martin Luther King group and celebrating the 20th anniversary of when he was gunned down, it would do a little better to find out which Nazis are being armed in the paramilitary poste comitatus to kill those black people and their children as soon as the time comes, and that's what we're getting ready to do. Another article, also in the San Jose Mercury, one was an editorial, the other was an article from France, Barbie's Legacy, a painful look at collaboration. And the point about this article isn't how he whipped or hurt people, but how the French people, when the war was over, suddenly changed from Pétain to de Gaulle and denied their involvement. And this is like the Americans saying, we want freedom, we want democracy, and funding Japan and funding Germany. When Pearl Harbor came and we were attacked, we jumped right in and said, no, we've got to fight democracy, even though we gave them the weapons to do what they were doing. We have to fight for democracy. And the minute the war was over, we embraced the Japanese and German and couldn't arm them fast enough. And this article is about the role of the French. And this Jane Kramer, who writes for the New Yorker, has some very interesting statistics on this. She says 30 million people in France today weren't even alive at the time. But there were only a handful of policemen, Gestapo policemen, that deported the Jews. But there were 34,000 French policemen, 30,000 policemen who could have done something and didn't. That they can't cry, you know, we have a Nazi war criminal here. There were 2,300 Gestapo police, and there were 30,000 French police before the Gestapo arrived. There also were 160,000 in the French resistance movement, and there were 170,000 in the occupation movement, equal in number. So that my figures are usually that 80% of the population could care less and does nothing. 10% opposes the forces of evil, and 10% are the evil makers who want to control the monopoly and the labor and so forth. Those are my rough figures, and they seem to back up what she's saying in her article about France. She says the heroic wartime France was a total myth. And, of course, France just fell in a few hours and said to Hitler, welcome, come back in, boy, this is fine. She says that they weren't great heroic people, that was a myth, and that after the war they wanted to forget their fascism, so they said that they were conservatives or they were nationalists, traditionalists, or that they were Catholics. And that would explain it. And up until this last year, when Mitterrand was president, Giscard d'Estaing, the president of France, wouldn't celebrate the National Armistice Day, May the 8th, when the war was over, because they didn't want to hurt the Germans' feelings. But Mitterrand has installed that day to remember the war, and this article tells about the violent anti-Semitism, and that a man named Maurice Papon, P-A-P-O-N, he was Secretary General under Pétain and the Vichy Nazis. He was prefect of police in Paris under de Gaulle. He was minister of budget under Giscard d'Estaing. Now he's under indictment for deporting Jewish children to Auschwitz. But we have the same thing. When John Kennedy becomes president of the United States, he has Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA. Dulles worked with the IG Farben, the OSS, the Nazis. Instead of bringing in a new team who surrounds himself with the same team, and you may as well have Eisenhower or Nixon as president, because under him, they're all the same team. He doesn't remove J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the FBI, who was vice president of Interpol with the Nazis. This woman writes in this story that the people had a small daily betrayal. They were small people betraying themselves, looking out for themselves, and the conclusions of this article make me ask the question of what is America, and what are you, and what would you do under these circumstances? She says they didn't think of hatred or extermination in terms of Mr. Pétain, who headed Vichy France. He didn't even have to talk about it. All he had to do was to see that the resistance was shot, and that neighbors could inform against each other, and that Jews were registered with the police. All they had to do was register and have the identity, then the Germans could do the rest. And when the police were ordered to round up 80,000 Jews for deportation, there were no Gestapo doing it. They went to the Jews quietly and put them in buses, and it never occurred to them, she says, that French policemen in French buses were delivering them to Germans. And that's the way it went. And they believed in France. They believed in their country. How trusting would you be if you were sent to a station to be moved because there's a hurricane, and you get on an airplane that's going to take you to a safe place? You end up at the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then you're taken to a space station like the LBJ, the space station in Houston, or down to Florida, and you're shipped up to a genocide alternative 3 space colony. How smart would you be? Would you figure it out, or would you trust your people? If we were really conquered and they wanted to eliminate 80% of this population, which they're planning to do, and building the massive airports down there, they have them. This work is documented in the book Alternative 3, and since then, this is just the way they went. They trusted the French police. They loved French justice, so the French delivered them to the Germans. So is Klaus Barbie, a Gestapo chief in Lyon, any worse than any person in France going on? And then she says in conclusion of her article that the one thing that really makes them proud over there and happy, Klaus Barbie, is that he's going to name people who turned in their children. He's going to name children who turned in their parents. He's going to turn in people who are in power today who told him to do what he did. And he's licking his chops. If he ever goes to trial, he's going to enjoy it. So that the trial of Klaus Barbie is a while away, but there is an inkling of doubt in people's minds that he doesn't know a lot that went on. He says he has lost his memory except for everything that he did at the time and who he did it with. So when he opens up Lyon, he's going to bring in a lot of crummy people. The same way if you lived in your own community or Monterey Peninsula and something like that happened here, and there was this mass migration and people were shipped off, and a man like Klaus Barbie was a police chief, and he survived he would name how Mr. Moskowitz came and said, my son went to see a communist meeting. Save me, my son was at the meeting. That's the kind of information he's going to pull in Lyon and tear the town apart if he has the trial. Now, one of the witnesses, possible witnesses to the Klaus Barbie case, died last week. He died in jail. Allegedly, he can't stand the idea of a trial. He was in Germany, not in France. Richard Wilhelm Fiese, F-E-I-S-E, 74 years old. He was one of the Germans that Klaus Barbie delivered the Jews to. He's a captain in the SS. He was supposed to go on trial. He died of poison. You know how easy it is to get cyanide if you're in a jail and they want to have a trial. They conveniently gave him this so that there wouldn't be a link to Klaus Barbie. It's obvious. Now, 3 other people are supposed to go to trial with him. Isn't this pathetic? One is 74, the other 73, 2 of them are 74, and this Fiese was 74. And they were part of the deportation, working with the French police from Marseille and other parts of France, who handed over 73,000 people to these 4 men, and then they shipped them to Poland to the gas chambers. So it took the officials around the local towns and the police they trusted, and they rounded them up, and then they delivered to the Germans, and then the Germans delivered to the Poles, so that there aren't many trials going on in Germany, because Poland did the murders, and the catch-22 is that Poland is behind the communist curtain, and we don't want them to die in the hands of communists. Now, we can give them the death penalty. 10 were hung at Nuremberg. We can hang them. We don't want the Russians to hang them. The Russians are cruel and sadistic and vengeful. Americans have justice and want to hang them their own way. But they don't want them in the hands of the Soviet Union because maybe they wouldn't die, maybe they would talk. And this way, they have a situation where they can give them a little cyanide and they take care of their needs. Well, I think it was interesting that the London Observer goes into the Opus Dei, into the Pro Deo, into the OSS to Father Felix Morleon in New York City, and then he, of course, as I said, goes right to the same address as William Taub. Taub close to Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who funded the very bank that began the troubles. They took that money, $89 million, they got greedy. They started with the Milan Mafia, pitted in Steve M. and Banco Ambrosione, and started drug dealing, and after the war escalated that money, when the war was over, to buy narcotics and weapons to arm the world for the Fourth Reich. You grow some poppies, you trade in the capital, you buy some guns and tanks and shells, and you have your ministers of death and your death squads, and you grow some more poppies and some more opium and hashish, and then the cycle goes round and round. So what they have now in the banks that have collapsed are the links of the Nazi war criminals, the mafia, and the organized crime drug dealers. They set up a perfect triangle that is in the news every day, and so that the Klaus Barbie stories this week came closer to the knighthood of various people from American intelligence in return for their protecting the Nazis. Well, that's a lot of material for you tonight. I think you can absorb that for the next week. It's time to go. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.